Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. I have some very exciting news. Right now I have the Z6iii in my hand and I've been stomping around the swamps here in Florida, taking lots and lots of great photos with it, tons of bird stuff, and just kind of giving you a first look review of this brand new camera. And let me tell you, this is something a lot of you have been wanting for a long time. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised with what I have to tell you in this review. But first, I want to address a few things. Number one, as always, the travel expenses down here were mine. Nikon's not paying me to come down here and do these reviews for you. This is 100% on me. Number two, this video itself has been shot with a Z6iii, so you kind of get an idea of the video quality. Number three, this is a pre-production camera. All the images you see are from the pre-production camera. All the video you see from the pre-production camera. So keep that in mind. This might be slightly different than the finalized final version here, but for the most part, I think we're pretty close. Oh, I almost forgot to remind you, keep in mind that not only is this a pre-production camera, but I only had it for a very limited amount of time, less than 24 hours. Basically, I had it for part of an afternoon, a couple hours in an evening, and a couple hours the next morning, and that was it. So everything in this video is based on a very small sample time with this camera. And number four, I know you're wondering about the Z7 III. Where the heck is it? Why do we only have a Z6 III? I asked the Nikon rep, and basically they say they are continuing to evaluate the market, so we don't have an answer one way or the other. We don't know what's happening there. But we do know that we have the Z6 III. So let's jump right into the review. So before we dig into the nitty-gritty, let's answer the question everyone has. When is this going to be available and how much is it going to cost? So it's going to be available, according to Nikon, late June, early July, and it's going to retail for $2499.95. Okay, so let's start with the ergonomics of this camera because this has changed a little bit from the previous version, the Z6 II. The Z6 III is a slightly larger camera. It's got a little bit bigger grip, a little bit better grip in my opinion. It's a little more comfortable. I can use it for longer periods. And although it's a little bit bigger, it's still not quite the size of a Z8. You can see there is a significant difference in size. So it's still very compact, very easy to travel with. And let's just kind of go around the block here as far as what's new on this camera. So again, the grip definitely improved. We still have a CF Express and SD card slot here on the side. Battery is still the same old battery that you've been using down here, the EN-EL15 series. We have the FN1 and FN2 buttons over here. Up at the top, we have a new little LCD illuminator, which is really handy. One of the bigger changes I noticed here on the back is the play button has been relocated down here in the corner like the Z8 and the Z9. And up here we have our frame rate. This is reversed from the old Z6 II. And of course, the new and improved little flip screen here. Allows you to flip vertical, horizontal. You can face it towards the camera or you can use it like so. It's been very, very handy. Next we have the side here, and the biggest difference between this and the Z6 II is we now have a full-size HDMI output here, which is very handy. We've been using it quite a bit with these cameras already. Also, keep in mind that because this camera is so lightweight, it works really well when you pair it with something like a 600 PF. It is a great hiking companion and perfect when action breaks out and you have to act really, really fast. So that's the basic ergonomics of it. It's still the same style and form factor that we've come to love with our Z6 and Z7 series cameras. It's just that it's a little bit bigger and a little bit more comfortable to use. Next, let's talk about the EVF because this was a pleasant surprise. Now, for a mid-range camera, you wouldn't expect it, but this has like the best EVF I've ever looked through. This thing is so good. It is 5.7 million dots. It is up to 4,000 nits, and it has a really wide color gamut. It is just absolutely fantastic. If you've ever had the experience with an EVF, if you're looking through it and you're like, geez, I'm looking at a computer screen here, this is not going to happen with this camera. You forget instantly that you're looking through an EVF when you bring this up to your eye. It just looks like, real life, maybe better than real life, because as the light gets a little bit lower, that really bright viewfinder in there makes it much easier to see your subjects and see what's going on in there. And I have been able to use this in a few low light situations on this trip, and let me tell you, this has been absolutely phenomenal. Like I say, it's not an exaggeration to say this is the best EVF I've ever used, and I hope that we see this quality of EVF in some other upcoming cameras. But yeah, this is fantastic. 2 thumbs up. Okay, so one of the big stories with this camera, of course, is that new partially stacked sensor, and it causes a little bit of confusion. So What's the difference between a fully stacked sensor, a partially stacked sensor, and your standard BSI sensor, your backside illuminated sensor, right? Well, this obviously fits right in the middle of those two. And basically the idea is that this is going to give you increased performance over a BSI, but it's not going to quite be at the level of something like a Z8 or Z9. But we do enjoy quite a few benefits from having that partially stacked sensor in there, because that sensor does have a lot of the same kind of circuitry on it, just not to the same extent that we see with a fully stacked sensor. So this means we have less blackout time between our frames. This means we can enjoy higher frame rates with our camera. We can do things like pre-capture with this camera. So you have all these benefits, plus this camera also has the XP 7 processor in it, just like the Z8 and Z9. So you combine all of that, and we have a much higher performance camera than we typically would with something like a standard BSI sensor. So how about durability and weather sealing, things like that? Well, without using the camera long term, it's hard to talk about durability, although I can tell you that previous generations of Z6s have really seen a lot of abuse from us, no problems at all. And this one seems to be built at least as well, if not a little better, than those previous generation cameras. So I think from a durability standpoint, nothing to worry about here. Weather sealing was very interesting. This has the same level of weather sealing as a Z8. So if you're going to be out in the weather, we're in Florida here, it rains all the time, no fear about getting this thing wet at all. Obviously you're not going to dunk it, but if you get caught out in the rain, she'll keep firing for you. Next, let's talk about frame rate, because that's something every action shooter is going to be interested in, right? So let's just start at the top. You can do 120 frames per second JPEG, and that is going to be in DX mode though. So we drop down to 60 frames per second. That's still going to be JPEG, but that's going to be full frame. We can also do the same at 30 frames per second. And again, JPEG full frame. And of course, you can use those two modes, 30 and 60 in DX mode if you want. However, if you're watching this video and you just follow me on this channel, you're probably a RAW shooter. So that's going to be 20 frames a second with the electronic shutter. And the nice thing about that is, because of the fast readout with this camera, I found that shooting 20 frames a second worked really, really well. I did not see any rolling shutter, despite the fact that I was using a fully electronic shutter. Again, because this sensor has a very fast readout. Again, they tell me it's not quite as quick as a Z8 and the Z9, but I was looking through my bird photos. I haven't looked at them on the computer, but I have been looking at them, on the back of the screen and through the viewfinder. I see no evidence of rolling shutter, even with faster subjects like red-winged blackbirds. So far, so good. So I say you can feel free to think about this as a 20 frames per second camera for action, at least so far.
Okay, so I was putting the video together and I realized that I might be sort of implying the wrong thing here. I do believe that for most wildlife action work, the electronic 20 frames per second option is absolutely fine for this camera. However, I was thinking about it, and there may be exceptions to the rule. We don't know yet. I was not able to test this stuff. This is, again, pre-production camera, very limited amount of time with it. But my concern would lie with really, really fast wing beats, something like what you get with a swallow or a bee eater or a kingfisher or a hummingbird. Anything like that might kind of stretch the limits of what we can do with the electronic shutter. We don't know yet, but if you do find yourself in a situation with this camera and you see some distortion in the wings or even gaps in the wing itself where there's space between it, maybe you switch to that 14 frames per second mechanical shutter. It'll be interesting to see how this pans out when we get the actual production cameras and can spend more time with them.
If you're using the mechanical shutter, this is going to get you down to 14 frames a second, and of course you can go lower than that. Now, let's talk about the way these frame rates work though, once we're around 20 and 14 and we have low and high and all that. So the continuous high extended is still a slideshow. If you remember from the previous versions of the Z6, you had like 14 frames a second or something, and it was a slideshow and you kind of could notice that it was a slideshow. At 20 frames per second though, the problem goes away because it's so fast that it actually took me a couple hours shooting with it before I realized that I wasn't looking at basically what was a blackout-free experience. Because at 20 frames a second, it's pretty much, film is like 24 frames per second. So at 20 frames per second, it's almost impossible to notice that you're not just shooting a blackout-free camera, which is really cool. Now, if you get into the normal frame rates, the high, the low, those frame rates, those you will see a blackout, but it's so much better than the old Z6iii. We have a comparison here, and I was blown away. I mean, there's still a blackout, but it's almost blackout free. If you look at the old camera though, it is like a very noticeable blackout. So this is a huge improvement over that. But for me, if you're shooting wildlife, I say just put on that 20 frames extended, that extended high, leave it on electronic shutter. That has worked wonderfully for me. Now, this camera also does pre-capture, and like the Z8 and Z9, this is still going to be JPEG, so you're not going to get raw pre-capture in this. Sorry, I know. He knows too, the Nikon rep knows, but this is where we are with it. So, but if you want to shoot pre-capture, though, you do have the option on this camera to do that, and you know, you can do that at 30, 60, 120, whatever you like there, and you know, it's a nice option on a mid-range camera.
Also, before we go on, yes, I will be putting together a wildlife photography setup guide for the Z6iii. And the best way to know when that's coming out, which will hopefully be September, October this year, but the best way to know when that's coming out is to sign up for my free email newsletter. Not only will it tell you when cool books like that are coming out, but I send out a tip every week that's going to improve your wildlife photography. It's a total win-win. Click that link in the description area. I put it right there at the top. Just give that a click. There's a sign up right there. You can sign up for the email newsletter in just a second. And before you know it, you're getting all this great stuff. Make sure you pause the video right now, sign up while you're thinking about it, and then we'll continue.
Next, I want to talk about the buffer because I was absolutely blown away. Nikon says that there's 1,000+ buffer in this camera for RAW files. And I was like, yeah, is there though? Honestly, 1,000+ is very accurate because that plus means like infinity as far as I can tell. It's just basically until you fill your card up. So let me give you an example. This is set at 20 frames a second. I have my stopwatch here. Let's see how long it goes. So I'm hit start and you can hear it firing away, 20 frames a second, just ripping them off. Okay, we're at 10 seconds now, which honestly is pretty respectable for any buffer, but here we go. Okay, here we are at the 1 minute mark, still going strong. Okay, we're at the 2 minute mark and I'm getting kind of bored with this. I imagine you are too. So I'm gonna stop doing this. And as you can see, the Z6iii has pretty much a bottomless buffer, and that is in full RAW. That's lossless compressed RAW. That's the largest one, and it just doesn't stop. So, you know, take that every other camera in the world, I guess. So if you're worried about the buffer, you don't have to worry about this one. This one is absolutely incredible. And again, keep in mind, this is a mid-range camera, and it's kind of smoking everybody else for the buffer. Oh, one more thing I have to tack onto the buffer section here. Despite this basically bottomless buffer, I was out using this and I was just ripping the shots off when I had birds going by. I just would not let go as long as I had the bird in the viewfinder. And I'll tell you what, even during intense action, and even though it was 90 degrees, never overheated, no problem at all. Didn't even get warm as far as the grip goes. Yeah, sometimes the cards get a little bit warm. No problem at all there. Next, let's talk stabilization and VR here. So this has upwards of 8 stops of VR, and let me tell you, when I was out actually using this in the field, it was very easy to keep stable. I could get down to some low shutter speeds, I could hand hold, no problem at all so far. But I am here in Florida, it is a little bit bright, so you know, I'm gonna have to further evaluate that, but still, it has pretty much class-leading stabilization if you ask me. It also has focus point VR, and basically what that's gonna do is it's gonna look at where your active AF area is, and it's going to centralize the VR stabilization around that point, so that enhances your stabilization even more. So this should be very, very good. Even in low light, even when you're kind of pushing those shutter speeds all the way down, this is going to help you keep very, very stable, and it seems to work really well based on my limited experience with it so far. Next, let's talk about the elephant in the camera, and that's that 24 megapixel sensor. I'm down here in Florida, and before this is even released, I can hear you up there complaining, saying, oh my gosh, 24 megapixel, that's too low, that's a deal breaker, I won't have it. And I get it, I understand that, because there are times you're dealing with a small, shy little critter, little bird, little animal, whatever, and you just can't get close enough, and cropping saves the day. I get that 100%, because you know, sometimes I don't like to do it, but sometimes I'm even forced to do it. However, you got to look at what you're getting here in return, because we're making a trade here, right? We have 24 megapixel in here, and what we're trading is speed and ISO performance, right? So one of the things that I've noticed over the years, I used to shoot D5, D6 all the time, 20 megapixel. had absolutely great images, and I was absolutely 100% willing to trade higher resolution for that kind of performance. And that's basically what we're doing here. We have a $2,500 camera that can shoot at 20 frames per second like a Z9, basically a camera that costs over twice as much. And it has an unlimited buffer, which the Z9 does not. So this is pretty cool. We're getting a lot of speed out of this. This also has a native ISO that goes from 100 to 64,000, not 6,400, 64,000. When you're out shooting with this thing, you can get in some really low light, which is great because we have things like this 600 PF, a nice 6.3 lens, very lightweight, but it's a little bit slow when that sun starts to get low, right? So we can go out with our 600 PF though, and we can use a little higher ISO maybe than we're normally comfortable with a higher res camera. And that's what your advantages are here. So what I would urge you to do before you just dismiss this out of hand is to consider that maybe there are some advantages here you could leverage instead. And the other thing with 24 megapixel and lower res cameras in general is that we have to think about our field craft, our field technique. Sometimes, again, 100% acknowledge that there are times that a high resolution camera saves the day. You just can't get that close. But there are also a lot of times I see that people can maybe get a little closer to an animal, and they don't. If you can safely get closer to an animal, you work on your field craft and learn how to do that. The other thing is that a lot of people actually shoot a little bit shorter focal length than they need. I see this all the time in workshops because they want that ability to crop afterwards. One trick that I've learned over the years shooting lower res cameras like this is to get it right in the field. Just learn your field craft. These cameras have a lot of automation. Start letting that automation help you get the photos and start using your leftover cognitive resources to maybe frame them a little bit better, maybe learn how to use longer lenses in the field and not have to go back home and rely on cropping to get your final composition. Learn to get it right in the field. And I think if you do that, you'll find the 24 megapixel can work really well. I know that these lower res cameras have worked really well for me, and I don't mind making that trade for speed and ISO performance.
Okay, so I'm bringing you into my office to talk about ISO. And as I indicated in the last segment, my seat of the pants kind of gut feeling about this camera based on looking at the photos, processing the photos and all that stuff is that this is going to be a very good low light, high ISO performer. However, I am not able to do any direct comparisons because it's a pre-production camera. And as of this moment, this is just over 2 weeks from launch date. As of this moment, no software has finalized profiles for this camera. So I'm not going to go in and show you some raw files and what the noise looks like because I don't know that it's an accurate representation of what a production camera is going to look like. Now I was able to open these files in Lightroom and that's how I processed my raw files. And it seemed like it was doing a good job, but it also felt like that profile really wasn't quite there yet. So I think that the production profile and the production camera are going to do even better than what I'm seeing. And what I was seeing was pretty darn good. So for now, what I'm going to show you are some JPEGs straight out of the camera at different ISOs. And I'm just going to kind of enlarge them and we'll talk about them. So let's take a look and we can kind of see how this looks on the computer here. So let's start with this great egret. And this is ISO 8000. And as you can see at this size, it looks pretty good. I'm going to go to 100% and we can take a closer look here. And once again, it's looking pretty good. You can see that at ISO 8000 here, we're not seeing a ton of disruptive noise. It is noisy. There is some noise here, of course, but it's looking pretty darn good. And we're seeing decent detail. Now, I know what the raw file for this looks like, and I can also tell you that there is more detail here. I've talked to Nikon about this. I've told them I think their noise reduction is sometimes a little aggressive and it eats a little bit too much detail. I know I could do a better job with this. But overall, though, I think this is looking pretty good for ISO 8000. A lot of people just wouldn't even consider going to this kind of an ISO, and I think this is completely usable. Next, we have ISO 12,800, and I'm going to zoom in again. And as you can see here, 12,800, not looking too bad either. In fact, I'm 100% confident that I could take this image and use my Lightroom denoise technique. And I have a 45-minute video if you want to learn how to do it, because it's more than just using denoise. There's a lot of different techniques you can use to really get the most from that program. And I have kind of a master class there on YouTube here. It's free. You can just watch anytime you want. But I am 100% confident that I can make this look like ISO 400. There's plenty of detail here. And just based on what Nikon was able to do with just this JPEG, I think it looks great at 12,800. So a lot of people, again, wouldn't dream of going that high. And this looks pretty darn good. I think this is very usable. Next, we have 14,000 400. Let me zoom back out so you can see the whole shot there, and now we'll zoom back in. This is 14,400 ISO. And again, it looks pretty darn good. We can see, if we look at around the eye here, we can see the orbital ring there. We can see the little bumps around there still. We still see some feather detail, although the noise is eating into it, or the noise reduction is eating into it a little bit. But based on what I'm seeing with these JPEGs and based on what I was seeing when I was processing the raw files, I'm very optimistic about this camera and its ability to perform in low light. So we'll have to take a look at some production samples and maybe compare them to the Z8 and Z9 down the road.
Next, let's talk autofocus, because I know as wildlife shooters, we're all interested in how the autofocus system in this camera performs, right? So we have a lot to talk about. This is a significant upgrade from the previous generation camera. So let's start with subject detection, because that's everyone's favorite. And the subject detection system in this camera has been completely revamped, and now it has an animal mode that is pretty much working the same way as animal mode in the Z8 and Z9. And it does not have the dedicated bird mode though, which is kind of unfortunate. I would have liked to have seen the dedicated bird mode in here, but animal mode for birds or animals does work pretty well. And I've really been putting that to the test here. I've been shooting lots of birds in flight, lots of static birds, and I'm finding that animal mode works just about at the same level as Z8 and Z9, which is good. Again, not quite as good as the dedicated bird mode, but pretty darn good. And I have a ton of sharp bird shots, both static and in flight, to prove it. So definitely good news on the subject detection front for this camera. And again, keeping in mind that it's like, less than half the price of a Z9. Next, let's talk about AF areas, because we have some new ones here, and some of these are kind of cool and unexpected. This adds 3D AF, so that's not a huge surprise. It also adds a couple more dynamic AF areas, plus these are the ones that are a surprise. We have 2 custom wide areas just like we do in the Z8 and Z9. So we can make our own custom wide areas in this camera and adjust them and do all that cool stuff. So that is really, really a nice upgrade to this. I did not expect to see that in this level of camera, and there it is. Next, let's talk about AF speed and performance, because one of the concerns that I think people have is how fast does it drive the lenses? With the old Z6iii, there was a noticeable difference between how fast it could focus something like this 600pf or my 600f4 between the Z6iii and something like the Z8 or Z9. Definitely could notice a difference. This one is noticeably faster. I can't say for sure how much or how close it is. It doesn't seem like it's maybe quite as quick as a Z8 or Z9, but it's noticeably quicker than the old Z6iii, so it's somewhere there. It's good. It's good. The other thing I want to talk about is the low light capability. This goes down to -10 EV, which is basically starlight. You can use it in starlight mode or not, but you don't need to go into starlight mode to enjoy the -10 EV low light performance. And I was out kind of testing that a little bit last night. I found some subjects in some kind of dark areas there, and the autofocus grabbed right on, no problem at all. It was very impressive. Oh, and as a side note, that -10 EV, that's the lowest in any Nikon camera, so that is really impressive. And again, keep it in mind, less than half the price of a Z9. Pretty good. Next, let's talk AF overrides, because guess what? Surprise, this camera can do them now. We didn't have that ability with the first 2 versions of the Z6, and it's something people screamed about. It's like, I want to press my FN1 button, go to like wide or auto or 3D or something. Guess what? You can do it here. The FN1 button, FN2 button, joystick, AF on button, all of them. And if you're not sure how that works, it's pretty simple. Let's say you're in auto AF and you wanted to go to single point AF. You could program one of your buttons so that when you press it, it goes to single point AF, and when you release it, it pops back into auto AF. So it's very, very convenient. So that was a great thing to find in here. I'm really, really happy Nikon finally let us do that. And get this, the new AF options don't end there. There's also new customizations in the focus menu of the camera for things like changing the color of our 3D AF area. One of them I really like allows you to change the color of the AF point when it gets something in focus, even in AFC mode, so it goes green. In AFS mode, it always does that, but in AFC mode, it always would stay red. This camera allows you to make it go green. We have focus point persistence, just like a whole slew of new AF customizations are available to us in the focus menu here too. So from an AF system standpoint, this camera is, again, a significant, I would even say a huge upgrade from the previous generation, the Z6iii. The Z6iii just really kind of blows it away from an autofocus standpoint. One of the questions I used to get all the time was, hey Steve, I can't afford a Z8 or a Z9, but I want to be able to take bird in flight shots. Which camera should I get? And unfortunately, I never had a really good answer for that, because the Z6iii was okay in that arena and you could definitely make it happen, but it wasn't great. This one has completely changed the game. You can absolutely do bird in flight with this camera and just general wildlife, no problem at all. So let's wrap this up. At this point in the video, you're probably wondering, should I get one of these or not, right? And I think there's a couple of different customers, a couple of different people who should consider one of these cameras, especially if you're a wildlife shooter. Now, the first category is somebody who has been wanting to get into mirrorless. Maybe you're shooting an old DSLR, something like a D750, D850, whatever, and you're trying to find an entry into mirrorless. But if that's describing you, and you kind of want to transition from your DSLR to mirrorless, this is the camera that you might want to consider for that. Because again, it's very capable. You can go out, you do birds in flight with it, and it does a good job. And I think you're going to find it superior to something like a D850 or D750. Really was impressive on this trip, at least for the kind of birds I was shooting. So I think that's kind of the first person that might want to consider something like this. Another kind of person that might want to consider this is somebody who maybe is in mirrorless but wants to get a little higher performance than what they're seeing, and they want to not break the bank doing it. And again, this one falls into that category pretty squarely. The other person I think that should consider this is someone shooting a Z8 or Z9, and they're looking for a backup camera, and they don't want to spend the money on another Z8 or Z9. I think this is a great choice for someone in that scenario. Another place where I would consider this, as somebody who travels a lot, and I'm always facing size and weight restrictions on these smaller aircraft, I think this would be a great camera to take on safari maybe, as a backup to a Z8 or a Z9, or a pair of these, just because they are so small and light. Based on my admittedly limited experience with it so far. I've only had it for one morning and one evening, but based on my limited experience with this camera, I would have no problem taking this along and using it, not just as a backup, but as a second camera on a safari or down to Costa Rica or Galapagos or out west or wherever I happen to be going. It is a very capable camera, and I'd have zero fear of using it in that capacity. So this is another consideration, and that's, you know, probably something we're definitely going to be doing ourselves with this particular camera, is taking it on trips when size and weight are definitely a factor. So the Z6iii is definitely a camera I am happy to recommend. I think that for a lot of people this is going to be a really good fit, and I think that kind of concludes our video. Now, if you enjoy educational material and learning about cameras and learning how to use these cameras, make sure you stop by my site and check out my educational materials. I think you're really going to like what you see there. Lots of field tested stuff, lots of Nikon stuff too. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Remember to share this video with your friends, and as always, have a great day.